So welcome back for this fourth lesson of Should Christians Go to War? Tonight we're going to continue what we were talking about last time on the Christian disapproval of war. And then after we go through a few more points on that, we'll get to the first section on some forms of the acceptance of war. Because we want to, again, look at both sides and see what was the early Christian practice and thought. So if we review a little bit what we were going through before, we talked about the life and teaching of Jesus, right? That was the first couple of lessons. And we saw that Jesus, he is teaching people to turn the other cheek, to love their enemies, not to kill, not to even sue your opponent. If he's suing you, just give it away, not to resist evil in that way. And so it's a very radical kind of lifestyle, right, that he's talking about. And so there's no violence of any kind that we see. We saw, what might be considered an exception with the whip of cords, but that was mostly used, according to the sentence there, the grammar, just for the sheep and the cattle, right, which we would expect for moving livestock out of somewhere. Right? Jesus doesn't hurt anybody. He doesn't do anything, but he commands everyone to get out. Right? Then the other thing in the New Testament that's often used is where Jesus says to go and buy a sword. They say, oh, see, that shows that we should be able to defend ourselves because he sent them out, to teach, and he told them to bring a sword. Well, we saw that he also makes it very explicit in that statement that he's going to fulfill a prophecy by that, and that prophecy is that Jesus would be counted with the transgressors, right? And when they produce two swords, he says that's enough, right? It's interesting, people say, oh, look, he said buy a sword. Well, they have two, right? That's fulfilled. It's enough. And the first time Peter ever uses it, Jesus condemns it, and it kind of gets Peter into trouble. And it gets Jesus arrested for sure, and everyone scatters and runs away, and we have no other record of Christians performing any kind of violent acts for over 100 years after that point. So there's definitely a lot of evidence from Jesus' life and teaching that we should be a peaceful people and not using violence, right? But then how should we act? How did the church act, right? So we looked at the last time about the condemnation of war in the abstract, right? These early Christians, all the way from 100 AD all the way to 300 and something, after 300 AD, they're all condemning war in its various forms, right? As one of the worst things that has happened to humanity, right? Demons have brought these things on us, right? That these evils, the mutual bloodshed between nations, is just a horrible thing, right? We saw the comparisons of, these nations, they'll punish one man if he kills just one man, but if you kill 1,000, then you're somehow honored in the gods, right? That it's not so much that one is better than the other, but one is just so much worse. You can't comprehend how to deal with that, so they end up honoring them. Now, societies have honored their warriors for a long time that were brave and strong and sacrificed themselves. And I don't want to disparage any of that, right? And we'll see tonight on the approval of war side that the Christians approved of that bravery. They approved of things that had gone on before. But their thought about their role and how they were going to fulfill their place in Christ's kingdom was not to be involved in violence of any kind, right? So there was this big condemnation of war across the board, and that Christians were bringing peace, right? The essential peacefulness of Christianity. We have peace from sin. We have peace with our fellow men. We have peace with God. There's just everything about Christianity is about peace, right? And a lot of these writers are telling the emperor, when they're defending the Christian faith to the emperors, guys like Justin and Aristides, they're saying, the Christians are the best hope you have for peace. We're the ones praying for peace. We're the ones teaching people to live in peace. We're the ones, changing the world this way. And that's our purpose in and among the people, is to be this salt and light and yeast and change the world around us to be like Christ, not to become polluted by the world. Then we also saw this section on the Christian treatment of enemies and wrongdoers, right? Going back again to Jesus' teaching of love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. Things written in the New Testament, as Paul writes, don't repay evil with evil. That was taken very strongly by the early church, right? And they wouldn't do that. They wouldn't even take their enemies to court, right? They didn't want to see people being punished, or much less put to death, right? Even if they were murderers or whatever. No. We want to have mercy on them. We want to bring them to repentance, right? That was the goal. And so we finished off the last lesson with this question of what's the best way to defend others, right? Because we said it is a Christian's job, right? It's part of a Christian's life to stop wrongdoing, right? To prevent these bad things from happening, right? But what's the best way to do that? Is it through our gentle moral appeal, our example, our bringing people to Jesus and showing people what Jesus would do? Or is it through physical violence and coercion like the rest of the world has used for time immemorial, right? And so we pretty much, I think, decided, based on what we see in the teachings of Jesus and the early church thus far, that the moral appeal has a lot going for it, right? And sometimes it's definitely the better situation. Everybody would like to avoid bloodshed. I think that's pretty well agreed most of the time, right? But let's take this a little bit further, right? This idea of defending others tonight, okay? Because one thing is, a lot of times you might say, well, I'm ready to step in and defend somebody if I see them being attacked or I see them being hurt, right? But what about all those people that are being hurt that you can't see, right? If physical force is your way of stopping violence, right? If it's allowed, well, what about the ones you can't see? There's this kind of idea that you see someone mistreating an animal or a horse or something. They're driving a cart, and you're like, oh man, you might stop it, but once they turn the corner, you're not going to run down around the corner and chase them down and force them to stop, right? You see, it's gone too far, right? But what about things that are happening all around us? If it's our job to stop wrongdoing, then we should do it, right? And if force is the proper way to do it, if we're supposed to go out and beat these people up and bind them and carry them away to jail or whatever it might be to stop them from hurting people, I mean, we know there's women around that are being abused. There's children that are being abused, right? If it's okay to use violence, then shouldn't we be going around patrolling and finding these things and bringing these people to justice at every opportunity, right? Just because we can't see it doesn't mean we don't do anything about it, right? Well, but we don't do that, right? I don't think anybody agrees that there should be, these Christian mobs that go around finding people doing what's wrong and forcing people to stop, right? So then we say, well, what about this other way, right? Evil's all around us, right? Violence is not the best solution, right? Force is not going to accomplish the change, right? Lots of people have been trying that for a long time. But the Christian life, our example, our teaching, is a much better method for controlling wrongdoing, right? Because when people see our life, they see something different. They see something outstanding, right? When they hear our teaching and they see our life matching up, then they know that something is really different about these people, right? And as the Christian message spreads out, there are fewer and fewer people that need to be restrained by violence, right? I mean, just talk to anybody that's been working in the jails, right? There's a lot of Christian ministries where these preachers go into the jail and they preach and they teach to these guys, and some of these guys have done some horrible things, right? And some of the most horrible, wicked sinners in the back, these big guys covered in tattoos, who knows what all they've done, they come weeping to the front, and they come out a very changed person, the most gentle guy that you might ever see, right? And so we can do that, right? We Christians have been doing that for 2,000 years. That's the best way to control wrongdoing, right? It's going to be more effective because it stops it everywhere, right? Now again, things are still going to go wrong, but if we know about it, we can try to do something that's in our power. If we can think of different ways to accomplish it rather than just through violence, right? And then we also have to think of what the Christians did to people that wronged them, right? There was persecution for hundreds of years. This period that we're talking about, this early Christian period, is the greatest period of Christian persecution, right? They suffered horribly. Thousands and thousands of Christians died, right? And yet they continued to live this life of peace. They continued to not fight back, right? And so we have to ask this question, right? Would anybody argue that those Christians that were being persecuted, that their suffering would have been less, or that the world would have been a better place if from the very beginning Christians, particularly Christian men, had acted on the principle that it was their duty to defend others by bloodshed and force, right? Because again, we go back, we don't see any examples of that, right? We read the New Testament, we read the book of Acts, we read the these early Christian fathers. We don't see these Christian guys going up and fighting off all their enemies. It's not like in the book of Esther where the Jews are going to be destroyed, and so they get the king to give them a day where they can kill all their enemies, right? That's what the Jews did. The Christians didn't do that, right? Imagine, right? We've got Saul of Tarsus going all around, right? I think I've mentioned this before, but we've got Saul of Tarsus going around persecuting the church, dragging families out of their homes, taking them down, voting against them, having them put to death, right? What would have happened if some Christian man had wanted to defend his family and just ran a sword through the Saul of Tarsus, right? Well, we wouldn't have an Apostle Paul, right? We wouldn't have half the New Testament, right? So we don't know what God has planned and what God has in store, right? God's mercy is great, and it's not up to us to be taking lives and doing things like that. When following his commands and putting our trust in him, he's going to repay all that, right? We don't return evil for evil. We return good for evil, right? We heap burning coals on their heads by feeding them and giving them water when they're thirsty, right? We leave room for God's wrath, as the Bible says, right? God says, it's mine to avenge. I will repay, right? Just like Jesus, he didn't fight back. He was like a lamb before the slaughter. He entrusted everything to God, right? Because this time that we have on earth is so short, right? God's going to deal with everything in eternity, right? So we have to keep that in mind. Because things, I don't think, would have been better at all if Christians had been fighting back the way these other groups did, right? They would have been wiped out, right? There's a story of a woman named Sabrina, and it was a practice in the, as time went along, right? People learned what Christians didn't like, right? And Christians were, very virtuous people. The women were pure, and so they would sentence these virgin Christian young ladies to, not to death, but they would sentence them to the brothel, right? They would go send them to be forced to work as slaves and prostitutes, right? And so no Christian knight came in to rescue her from this horrible fate, right? Her only answer to the judge or whoever it was that sentenced her was, the holy God will see about that, right? God's going to deal with you guys for doing this, right? She didn't resist and stop it. Um, she didn't fight for her life despite this horrible thing coming on her. Um, but she turned it to God. Right? So that's an interesting story. And so when we think about all the tortures and different things that were endured by these people, they weren't cowards, right? Sometimes people accuse people, you want to say you're a pacifist, oh, you're just a coward. You don't want to. No, that's not about cowardice, right? It's about what did God say to do, right? Um, Christians should be willing to lay down their lives for people, right? For the truth, for what's right. That's not cowardice to give your life to die in peace, right? But sometimes it's presented that way, and sometimes, honestly, people use pacifism as an excuse for cowardice, right? And that's not good, right? If you're going to be truly following the words of Jesus, you can't be a coward, right? You can't just use it as a way out. I think I give that example before of Desmond Doss, the guy that joined the U.S. military as a medic back in World War II. He was a conscientious objector. He never held a gun or anything, but he went into the line of fire over and over again to rescue people and bring them back and save them. He saved hundreds of lives, right? So he's definitely no coward, right? But he's not going to take a life. He's not going to do that because it was against what Jesus has said to do. So when we consider their situation and what happened in all this time, the only explanation that makes sense is that these people were just simply devoted to following the teachings of their master, right? Of changing the world for good, and doing that more than anybody had ever done before that, and honestly more than anyone has done since then, right? I mean, so much of the world changed at that time, right? They were able to just kind of overturn the culture, and eliminate so many of the things that were going on at that time, right? Christians were the first ones that were really, they were pushing to be against abortion and leaving your babies out to be exposed to die because you didn't want them, right? They adopted people. They were charitable giving, things that were kind of unknown in the Roman world, right? This devotion to peace and caring for your enemies, it changed everything, right? Now, again, over time, the church became corrupted and became, the church at large, visible to everybody, became entangled in politics and things like that, and gave up its purity, you might say. But for a long time, the church was doing amazing work, right, and changing the world. Another thing we want to talk about as we talk about the disapproval of war is the Christian experience of evil in the character of soldiers, right? So obviously, if you see soldiers doing a lot of bad things, especially if those bad things are directed at you, you're not going to want to be a part of that, right? So that's going to kind of influence their line of thinking, right? And so when we think about it, we look at John the Baptist, right? Jesus, James, Peter, Paul, all of these guys and more were all abused and killed by soldiers, right? Whether they were Jewish or Roman. I think pretty much these were all killed by Roman soldiers. Herod would have had a praetorium guard, so they would have been Roman. That's something, right? You're not going to want to be associated with the people that killed all the prophets and killed Jesus and killed the apostles, right? Then you get to about 64 AD, right? This is when Paul and Peter start running into their greatest trouble in the time of Nero, right? Nero persecuted Christians officially, right? So the Roman government is now directing itself against Christians. And it wasn't constant, right? It wasn't all over the empire. It fluctuated in places and with different emperors to different levels of severity. But for 250 years, the church was thoroughly persecuted by the Roman government, right? All over the Roman Empire. And so we see to terrible things happening. And I think I mentioned before the Roman army, right? The soldiers were also the Roman police, right? They were the military force and the police force all in one, right? And they were responsible for the torture and execution of any Christian that was brought up on charges against the empire, right? If you were a Christian, you were accused of all sorts of horrible things, a lot of them kind of concocted by the Jews, based on misunderstandings of the Lord's Supper and different Christian practices. And so the fact that Christians were accused of atheism, right, because they didn't believe in the gods of the Romans and the Greeks and such, of not being loyal to Caesar because they wouldn't make sacrifices to him and that kind of thing. And so, again, they would be tortured and executed. Torture was quite common, even as a way of extracting information, of interrogating people. We can see that even in the New Testament, right? Paul is going to be beat so they can figure out, why this mob happened out there. What do they have against you? But it was only because he was a Roman citizen that he was able to avoid a beating without trial, right? We've got Christians being burned at the stake, put to the rack, covered in boiling oil, beaten, flogged, crucified, beheaded. I mean, it was terrible. There was one story, you read these stories of the martyrs, and this lady that is there, and the soldiers are supposed to, they've been told to take this boiling oil, and they're going to pour it on her, starting at her feet and working their way up to her head, right? And she just tells them, they're kind of apologetic because she's just meekly sitting there waiting, right? She's not fighting against them. She's not struggling. She's just kind of composing herself and, entrusting it to God, right? Get ready for God to do this. And the guys start pouring the oil, and there's so many stories of these kinds of things like this where she doesn't even cry out, right? Or they're burned at the stake or something like that, and they just meekly die, even telling the guys that they forgive them, And in a lot of instances, it led to the conversion of those soldiers that were putting them to death, right? Because they just saw what was happening with these people that they were being told are so wicked and have done all these things, and yet here they just accept it and forgive me, right? And so it changed a lot of hearts, right? But if they'd been fighting back and doing all this stuff, it would have just confirmed a lot of the rumors that had been spread around, right? But this example that they gave was quite the opposite. But of course, just because one person can take it well and meekly doesn't mean that all the people are going to like the soldiers that did it, because some of them might repent, but some of them might not. You still might come to naturally to despise these people that are treating you with so much contempt. Whole churches were destroyed. The Praetorian Guard would come in battle array. They had axes and instruments of iron and just destroy the churches that were there, right? That they'd come up to build. There's even a story in Phrygia. The soldiers came in and burned the entire population of a small town, right? Everyone, basically the whole town had converted to Christianity and was a happy little place. And these soldiers came in and just killed everybody, right? I think we saw something similar to that, right? Back in the time of Pliny, right? When he's writing his letter, we talked about that in regards to the historical reliability of the Bible before, that all these people are Christians, right? Or were accused of being Christians. And so he's wondering, who do I make some exceptions for age? Do I make some exceptions for, whether they still claim to be Christian or not? Should I just try them and execute them, right? If they confess to being Christians, he had them executed, right? And even though they hadn't done anything wrong. And so that was a really tough time, right? You can imagine being very much against the government, or being very tempted to hate these soldiers that were doing all this horrible stuff to your brethren, right? but yet the church persevered. Then, of course, last in the Christian disapproval of war is just the flat refusal to participate, right? All the evidence so far points us in the direction that Christians would refuse to serve as soldiers, right? And we do have a little bit of information that seems to agree with that. Now, we talked about the New Testament, right? We talked about Cornelius. We talked about the one or two soldiers maybe that had been baptized with him, the Philippian jailer, right? These guys are the only examples of soldiers in the New Testament, right? Now, we don't know what happened to them, right? We don't know what they did afterwards. The Bible doesn't give us any information about that specifically. But after them, we don't have any direct evidence, any reliable evidence for the existence of a single Christian soldier until after 170 AD, right? That's over 100 years, right? There's no evidence. Now, somebody might say, well, there's not a lot of evidence because there's not a whole lot of writers in that time, and maybe that's true. But the evidence that we do have seems to show that they didn't do that. Tatian, who wrote about 180 AD, he condemned war as murderous. And Harnack is a German scholar that went back and looked at a lot of this stuff before and wrote a book called The Christian Militia. And he wrote about Tatian. He said that he was undoubtedly opposed to the military calling. He wrote, "I do not want to be a king. I do not wish to be rich. I decline military command. I hate fornication." Right? So several things there that we might object to as Christians, right? For one reason or another. But declining military command, not wanting to be involved in warfare, there we see by Tatian. If we go back to Justin Martyr in around 150, he's trying to reply to Celsus. Actually, wait, that's not Justin Martyr. It's Origen. Origen's replying to Celsus, excuse me. So the heathen philosopher Celsus is writing, and he's trying to get Christians to support the government, right? Well, not just support, but join in the government, take part, right? To give the emperor strength. He says, fight for him, serve him as soldiers if he requires it, right? Share in the military command with him. His argument, the argument of Celsus, is that if everyone behaved like the Christians, then the emperor would be left alone. He wouldn't have anybody to fight for him or be in the government, and the empire would fall apart. The barbarians would come in and take over, right? And so you can see from that, if everyone was like you, then there wouldn't be anybody serving in the military. Then that shows that the Christians, as a rule, didn't serve in the army, right? They didn't serve in the civil government either at that time. So that's a very different kind of thing than we're used to today, obviously, right? Because so much of the world is that we're familiar with is nominally Christian, that they're all over the government and the army, right? So we're not used to seeing it that way. But that's the way it was in the beginning. And so that gives us some things to think about, right? The first reliable evidence of Christians in the Roman army comes from the time of Marcus Aurelius, right? So that is from about 160 to 180 AD, right? This is where we first start getting references to Christians being in the army, whether they were, had converted while they were in the army, or if they joined later on. I think it's even later on that we see them coming in. But Harnack, again, he says, it's not therefore surprising that until the time of Marcus Aurelius, a question of military service did not exist in the churches. The baptized Christian did not become a soldier, and those who were caught by the Christian faith in the camp had to see how they could come to terms with the military profession, right? So again, this is the guy that scoped out basically the whole of Christian thought on this from the very beginning all the way up until later years, because again, we're talking about early Christianity, but you go a few hundred years down the road, things are going to drastically change, right? But at this beginning time, if you were a baptized Christian, you didn't become a soldier. That's the way it was. And if you were a soldier who became a Christian, then you had to figure out what you were going to do, right? How are you going to deal with this, right? that was the situation of the first 200 or 300 years. Well, particularly the first 150 years, right? Though after that, things, again, it's kind of a steady progression, right? Once you have a few people in the army and it gets well known, then you might have a few more, and then a few more, and then, well, if they're in there, why can't we be in there? And there's this discussion that goes back and forth because not enough people are getting the whole story here, right? So we find a turning point around the time of Tertullian, right? Tertullian's in that around 200 AD, 220, and he shows in his writing that there seemed to be a considerable number of Christians in the army at that time. Now, considerable, I don't know what that means. It's an issue that he's raising, right? That there are Christians serving in the army, right? And he's talking about some of the difficulties that you're going to run into if you want to be in the army. And we'll see later on, I think in the next lesson, that there's some reason that you might want to be there, right? That, we've got a flag in the enemy camp, right? We've got a Christian there that can reach out to these guys, right? But even in Tertullian's time, right, there was a very strong unwillingness to serve in the army, right? And Tertullian goes through some reasons. Let's look at some of his reasons. Now, remember, he makes this statement that we would go to war. Christians would go to war if it weren't for the fact that it's more lawful to be killed than to kill, right? That was kind of his summation of some of Christ's teachings, right? That we don't go to war because it's better for us to die than to kill someone else, right? And before he gets into the particulars of the war, he talks about sacrifices a lot and other things. He also talks about even being a magistrate, right? He talks about the possibility of being a judge, right? And he says you could be a judge if you can avoid all the objectionable things that judges have to do, right? And he actually makes a list. He says, if you can do it, if you can be a judge without sacrificing or giving your authority to sacrifices or contracting sacrificial victims or assigning the care of temples or seeing after the revenue or giving shows, right? The gladiatorial shows and the charioteer shows that were going on, either at his own or public expense, or presiding over them when they have to be given, or making a proclamation of an edict of any solemnity, even swearing oaths, right, or judging anyone on a capital or criminal charge. Now, Tertullian does make this thing. Okay, if you want to be a judge, you could judge about money. You could allow that, right? But you're not allowed to judge a capital or criminal charge. You're not allowed to condemn anyone or bind anyone or imprison anyone or torture anyone. Those are not things that Christians can do, right? You can't be involved in all the sacrifices. Jesus says not even to swear an oath. So how are we supposed to be a judge if you're not supposed to swear? How are you supposed to be a judge if you can't judge any criminal and actually inflict any punishment on him, right? You're not going to be a very successful judge, right? And because all of these things are condemned in Jesus' teaching, right? So, if you want to be a judge, you could be one of these kind of small claims court judges, that they have that are deciding between two parties that come in and say, oh, he didn't pay me rent for all this time, and oh, he owes me money for my broken car, and you get the whole story, you get the truth out of them, and then you decide who owes who money, right? And you're not forcing anyone to do anything, you're just deciding these cases, right? That's a very different thing than, hurting anybody or putting anyone to death. Or even imprisoning anyone. Those are things that we're forbidden to do. And then he goes in to talk about soldiering, right? He says, how will a Christian make war, right? How can you even serve as a soldier in peacetime without the sword, which the Lord has taken away, right? He says, for all those soldiers had come to John and received the form of a rule, right? So remember John the Baptist, some soldiers came to him and they said, oh, what should we do? And he says, well, don't extort anybody. Be content with your pay, right? People look at that and say, well, see, look, we can be soldiers, right? Because it was okay with John. Well, was John a Christian? No, right? He was still a Jewish prophet, right? He was before Christ had come, before the kingdom was there. So that it might be something that we can look at, but it's not a Christian teaching. It's a pre-Christian teaching, right? And so they got this rule from John. And yes, the centurion believed, with Cornelius. Tertullian says we know that. But the Lord, in disarming Peter, he ungirded every soldier, right? You take the belt off. You don't have the sword, right? You can't carry it anymore. God said, put it away. And then Tertullian continues, he says, and shall he who is not the avenger even of his own wrongs administer chains and imprisonment and tortures and executions? Right? If we're supposed to turn the other cheek, if we're not supposed to resist evil, then how can we imprison people and chain them up and torture them and execute them? That doesn't make any sense, right? That's not something that we can do. And so he says, of course, the case is different if the faith comes on someone already in the military service, right? So he says, he's basically saying you can't be a Christian and become a soldier. That just doesn't work, right? But if you are a soldier and faith comes to you, then what are you going to have to do, right? He says, well, once you accept the faith, either you have to leave the service at once, as has been done by many, right? So the main way that happened was Christians, if they were a soldier, they became a Christian, they got out of the service if they could, right? He said, but if you don't do that, then you've got to make all these objections, right? You've got to do all this stuff to make sure that you're not committing anything against God, right? You've got to avoid all the sacrifices that have to be offered, right? Because the Romans were daily offering sacrifices to Caesar. You can't be involved in that, right? You can't be involved in oppressing anyone or hurting anyone or torturing anyone, or, so you could be a soldier, but what good are you as a soldier? Because you're not allowed to do any of the things that soldiers are supposed to do, right? And so that's a pretty big thing. And again, this is almost 200 years after Jesus, he's writing these things, right? So this has been the predominant view of Christianity for nearly 2 centuries at this point. And he makes this statement, which is one of my favorite quotes of any of the church fathers. He says, no necessity of sinning have they whose one necessity is that of not sinning, right? People will say, oh, we have to do this, right? I know it's bad, but, it's the lesser of 2 evils or something like that. He's like, no, the one thing that's required of us is to not sin, right? That's the one thing that's necessary as a Christian, is to not sin. So you can't say that sinning in this case is necessary. No. That's foolishness, right? If sinning is necessary in that case, then that is something you need to avoid at all costs, right? Even the cost of your life. Right, and that's what we see in Hebrews, right? You've not yet resisted to the point of shedding in your struggle against sin. You've not yet resisted to the point of blood, right? Are we willing to put our life on the line so that we won't sin? That's a good question. That's a question that hopefully none of us have to struggle with. But if we're faced with it, the answer is, what does Jesus say? Cut off your hand. Gouge out your eye, right? Don't sin. That's how serious he is about it. And people like to say, well, Jesus is just using a metaphor. He's just using hyperbole or something. Maybe he is, but you can't, again, remember we talked about the spirit and the letter of the law, right? If we want to say that Jesus is using hyperbole, well, we can't just turn it around and do exactly the opposite of what he said, and go against his teaching because we think that it's necessary. That's not what we're supposed to do. Now, admittedly, though, one of the big problems that Tertullian and all these other writers had with the Christians in the military was idolatry, right? Idolatry was rampant throughout the Roman army, but bloodshed and violence were just as bad, right? And so they condemn both equally as not something that Christians should be involved in. And so doubly, they shouldn't be in the army. Several writers also refer to alternative service, right, that Christians provide to society, right? It's not that we're just passive people, just cogs in a machine or something like that, but we're actively, living our Christian lives, offering our prayers, doing our good deeds, all these things that, even though we're not involved in public affairs, we're still contributing to society. We're still doing service to the emperor, to the king, or to the government, whatever, right? We're doing our duty that way. And another interesting thing is there are church orders that get written out, right? Because, the church becomes more and more organized over time, right? You start where there's these small groups. A lot of them are maybe underground. There's so much persecution. But by the time you get to the 3rd century, the 4th century, the 5th century, Christianity is starting to rise and get more and more popular, and churches are becoming, more and more structured, right? And so you're getting big official church orders that govern, whole provinces of the Roman Empire, for Egypt or for Syria or something like that, right? And so some of these church orders from the 3rd and 4th and 5th centuries, you can go back and you can read them. They were enforced for centuries, but they forbade soldiers and magistrates from even being immersed or taking communion, right? If you were a soldier, if you were a magistrate, you weren't allowed to participate, right? Unless you put away the sword or took off your garland or whatever it was, and you repented. And that was the official position of the church, like written in thing. No, if you're a soldier, if you don't stop being a soldier, we can't baptize you, right? We can't give you communion. If you've gone off to join the army, you're basically excommunicated. That was the official position of at least half the church for centuries, right? And so where did that come from? If it, really, where did the change come from, right? Where did it come that, you had to be a Christian to serve in the Roman army? Because that's what the situation was by 411. There was this drastic change in the 4th century where everything shifted from being almost no Christians in the army to no non-Christians in the army, right? So what was the big change that happened in the 4th century? We'll get to that as we go along. We go back to Origen, again in the mid-200s. He makes the argument that pagans, right? He's talking to the Romans. He's like, you guys don't require your priests to serve in the army, right? You don't let them shed blood. Only the sacrifices. That's all. They're kept pure. They're kept away from all of that so that they can be pure and offer sacrifices to God, right? Because if your priests get defiled, then your sacrifices won't be accepted, right? That's Origen's argument. So he's saying, so we are priests, right? We're a kingdom of priests. That's what Christians are, right? A royal priesthood. We offer spiritual sacrifices, right? We offer our own lives. We offer our prayers. We offer our thanksgiving, our good deeds. All of these things are our service to God. And so we should be away from bloodshed, right? That's not our purpose, right? God has given us a job to do, right? And if we try to take on a different job that conflicts with that, then he's not going to be pleased with us, right? And he's not going to accept our sacrifice. Origen goes on to say that Christians should do their military service as priests and servants of God, right? And, that honestly, that continues today as an accepted thing, right? If there's a country that drafts in somebody, there's a certain group of, you might say, conscientious objectors, right? That my religious beliefs prevent me from doing this, and okay, you can go be a cook, or you can be a priest, or you can be a chaplain or something, right? You can be a medic. That they allow for that, right? But unfortunately, the majority opinion of Christianity today is different than what it used to be. There was a change. But Origen says here that the Christians should keep their hands pure, right? Pray to God on behalf of those who righteously serve as soldiers and of him who reigns righteously. So that's interesting. So we see Origen's opinion is that it's not bad to be a soldier, right? That these soldiers in the Roman army, they're doing their righteous duty as soldiers, serving under a righteous king. If we recognize the authority of the king being put there by God, right? And the role of the government. That's what we see in Romans chapter 13, right? We recognize the authority and submit to the authority of human governments, right? Human institutions, and that God put them there for a reason, right? So we're not condemning them for doing that, but it's just that as Christians, that's blocked off to us. That's not our job. Our job is now over here, right? We've moved into this other team, right? That we have our own duties, right? We've been set apart for a special purpose, and we need to keep that in mind. What happens is that, over time that got lost because Christianity got broken up, where instead of us all being priests, well, there's going to be this special group of priests, and then the regular Christians down at the bottom, right? And so, the priests, the Catholic priests or whatever might be able to exempt themselves from war, but the regular people, well, you do your own thing, right? But that doesn't exist in the New Testament. You go back and look. There's not this separate ministerial priesthood, right? That was a later invention. The original was just we're all priests of God. We all have our service to offer of a particular kind. And so Origen is noting that to these guys, right? Again, Origen writes later on that the Christians benefit their countries more than do the rest of men. They're educating the citizens. They teach them to be devout toward the God of the state. So we have our job, right? And in fact, if we're doing our job properly, we're going to be more beneficial to the country than any number of soldiers or police, right? Because we're going to be teaching people to be devoted to God. We're going to be teaching people the truth. And people need to hear the truth, right? That's what it's for. The truth will set you free, right? And he talks all about just wars, right? The concept of a just war. Origen believed in that. But in his context, in what he's talking about, it always is these non-Christians that are waging the wars, right? Now, there can be unjust wars, obviously, but he's making the point that, if you're a king over this place and you go wage a war against this guy because you're trying to set free something, or whatever the context is, or you're defending yourself against an invader or something, those are just and right things to do. That's your job as the ruler of the country, right? But he's always talking about that in a non-Christian perspective, right? Because it was the non-Christians that were in charge, right? So his view, again, is our duty is very clear, right? He says it this way: once you've accepted Christianity, you have to put away the use of arms, right? That's just something that is not suitable for a Christian. And so it makes an interesting thing because, for instance, in the United States,
the term just wars, just war.
Yeah.
It is they got it from Romans chapter 13 that Paul went on to say that the government does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God and not the avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer.
Yeah, there's that, and then Origen's going to talk about it. Augustine later on is going to talk about the concept of a just war, and come up with some things of what makes a just war, and maybe we can have a lesson on that, the particulars of that. Not next week, I think, but the week after we can get into that a little bit. But
I just would like to point out that they see this passage giving the government responsibility to use the sword
Yeah.
to punish evildoers.
That's true. And again, that's one of these things that, again, all throughout this early history of the church, right? Yeah, the government has that authority, right? But Christians weren't part of the government, right? Um, they weren't in that capacity, and they never saw themselves as going into that capacity. In fact, like we said, those church orders, if you went in as a soldier or you went in as a magistrate, someone that was supposed to wield the sword in judgment, then you gave up your right to communion, right? You're in sin. You're out of the church until you repent and come back, right? That was the church's position, right? Now again, after Constantine, things are going to start to change, right? But we have to ask, was that change a proper change, or what? Do we need to go back to the original? So we will have to consider that as we go through tomorrow's lesson too. Okay, a few more things here. The relative justification that Origen makes, right? He justifies non-Christians in warfare, right? And that's fine. That's good. But he's not being inconsistent, right? Because non-Christians do this. They have a certain standard that God kind of expects them to live by, the laws of the government that he's put in place for whatever purpose. But Christians, on the other hand, have a different standard, right? Just like the Jews had a different standard than the nations around them, right? Even though God was always the one that, he put Nebuchadnezzar into power. He put Cyrus into power, And even though these guys did good and bad things, there's a standard there. Now that's not to say that it's, that they're going to be saved or something like that. I don't know, right? That's not an issue I want to get into. But there are different rules for different groups of people, right? And so if you want to be a Christian, you have to follow the Christian rules, right? If you're not going to follow Christ, well, you can do whatever you want, right? Now you're going to have issues. You're going to run into a lot of difficulties, and you're going to face judgment in the end. But the point of Christianity is that we follow our Lord, right? Then there's another guy, Lactantius. Again, he was writing about the time of Constantine. It says he rules out both military service and capital charges, right? So that's, putting people to death and such, on the ground that because they involve homicide, they're a violation of justice, right? So again, this is 300 years after Jesus, right? These writers of the church are still showing that you can't be involved in the military and you can't put people to death because it kills people. And that's not what we're supposed to do, right? He says here, and so it will not be lawful for a just man to serve as a soldier, for justice itself is his military service, nor to accuse anyone of a capital offense, because it makes no difference whether you kill with a sword or with a word, since killing itself is forbidden. And so in this commandment of God, no exception at all ought to be made to whom the rule that it is always wrong to kill a man, whom God has wished to be regarded as a truly sacred creature, right? We're not supposed to kill each other. And that was the Christian thought. Again, we want to lead people to repentance. You can't lead anybody to repentance by killing them, right? That just cuts off any chance of repentance that they have. And so Christians for at least 3 centuries upheld that view, right? And so that powerful quote is going to end our discussion on the Christian disapproval of war. The next thing we're going to do is go on to some ways that they did approve of war. But I think we should probably wait until next week for that. What do you think?